Talk just a minute about a very tense moment in the Cold War in 1956. The British were very involved in Egypt at the Suez Canal. Of course, the British had built the Suez Canal, and the Middle East during the 1950s and even today is a vastly important place in the world because of the vast amount of oil reserves. I want you to pay attention here to how careful and wise Eisenhower's reaction is to this particular situation. This also goes against the narrative that Americans always and only side on the side of the nation of Israel. The leader of Egypt, a man named Nasser in the 1950s, wanted to separate from Great Britain. And Eisenhower and our Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had a very strong policy in order to keep good relations with both Israel and with the Arabs. And so in order to make sure that we have a good relation with both, we offer a loan to the Egyptians to build a dam on the Nile River. Nasser makes life difficult for us when we learn that he has been taking weapons from Czechoslovakia, which of course is controlled by the communists, as well as from Red China. And so Dulles moves to cancel the loan since they had violated the agreement that we had in place for the loan. We don't want the Egyptians siding both with the United States and with the communists taking favors from both. And so Nasser counters our canceling of this loan by attacking the Suez Canal, which was owned and operated by the British. And it works. They're successful in kicking the British out. And so the British, the French, and the Israelis plot together outside of the UN to forcibly attack and retake the Suez Canal by force. And the attack works. Eisenhower, of course, is very concerned that this destabilizing of the region will allow for the Russians to come in. He calls for the Israelis, who are the main ones in the attack, to pull back. He brings this forward to the UN, and it passes the UN for the Israelis once again to pull back and let Nasser, at least for the time, have the Suez Canal. The third world was amazed. The United States here seemingly are standing up for the Arab world. Shocking. Eisenhower is so angry that the whole region is destabilized by this situation that he calls up Prime Minister Anthony Eden of Great Britain, cusses him out, and after he gets on the phone, it's reported that Anthony Eden actually cried about it. It's about this time that the Soviets get into the act and they start sending troops down into the Middle East. And this, of course, becomes very, very tense. Eisenhower responds by putting all American troops on alert, and then it is decided in the UN that the Suez Canal will be taken and will be operated not by the Egyptians, not by the Israelis or the British, but rather by the UN itself. And this is ultimately what happens. At this point, the crisis is past, and Eisenhower tells the Russians to get back to Russia. And they take his threat seriously. Go Eisenhower. Now, during all of this time in the 1950s, Americans at home were living the good life. Soldiers back from World War II were raising their families, driving their now 2 cars rather than 1, having their nice suburban houses, their housewives, their 2.5 kids, and the dog. There's a legitimate concern on the part of many of these families during the 1950s, and that's the concern for nuclear holocaust. And so we're going to look at a little film right now about how Americans dealt with this fear. So there you have it, duck and cover. Why do you think this video would be shown? Sure, you might be a little bit better off for a short time if the atomic bomb goes off and you duck and cover. But if you're anywhere near the blast radius, you will likely, of course, suffer from all sorts of radiation poisoning. So why would they do this? My argument would be that they're doing this in order to Let children have comfort. Don't worry. Psychological lies. Don't worry. If the atomic bomb goes off, all you gotta do is duck and cover. You'll be fine. Grab a newspaper, throw it over your head, and you'll be good. Be like Bert the Turtle. And I think that probably did cause some comfort. However, in the reality of things, probably ducking and covering isn't going to help you survive a nuclear attack, or even an atomic attack, as the movie was made before the nuclear bomb had been fully developed. Let's talk a little bit about the American mind in the 1950s. Were the Americans aggressive? Were the Americans wanting to go fight the Cold War? Or were the Americans mostly concerned about life at home and themselves? That's it. Life at home and themselves. You guessed it. The Americans were pretty happy outside of that fear that the atomic attack could happen. Eisenhower was popular. Americans were comforted with him as their leader. The political left, and I'm talking about the socialists, completely in disarray in the 1950s. And while the right was definitely stronger, the right too did not have control. Eisenhower, of course, a moderate Republican, was the one in control. And of course, like I mentioned before, you have the John Birch Society. We already talked a little bit about what the John Birch Society is. And so you do have sort of this extremism in America on the fringes, but once again, the center holds in American life, and this is ultimately a good thing. Some have accused the 1950s of not being a time with any culture. The culture at the time was pretty bland. Well, I just want to point out really quickly that the 1950s is one of the best decades for American film. We've got not only John Wayne films, you see John Wayne there at the bottom right of your screen, in his film Hondo with his dog. But also this is a time of great films from Alfred Hitchcock, films like Rear Window, Vertigo, North by Northwest. This is a time for not only popular music, Frank Sinatra and the like, but also a time for a challenging new type of music to take front and center stage for Americans. And of course, I'm talking about rock and roll. I'll talk about that more in a minute. The American people tended to focus on life at home, as I've already mentioned. And so we had Levittown in the late 1940s start churning out these little suburban houses, much bigger than the houses that were built in the 1920s. The last time we really had a housing boom in the United States was in the 1920s. Right? Good times, prosperity, houses going up everywhere. The 1930s, the Depression, and through World War II, not many homes were built in the United States. But in the late 1940s, all of a sudden, suburbia begins to grow once again. We've got automobiles, and now not just one automobile, but now many families had two automobiles where the husband and wife could both have an automobile to drive. That wasn't universal, though. You can tell, by the way, what era the house was built in based upon how big of a garage they have. Is it a two-car garage or is it a one-car garage? One-car garages were mostly built in the 1920s, and then by the 1950s, two-car garages, of course, become much more popular. So suburbia begins during this time. The downtown areas become less populated, and the suburban areas grow where everyone can have their own little patch of yard. In the 1950s, we also see the creation of a new type of person. We'll call them the teenager. Before the 1950s, throughout most of human history, in fact, people the ages of 13 to 18 were mostly considered adults. They were expected to work for their own food. They were expected to take care of themselves. Many people were already having children by the time they were in their mid to late teens. This was just life for most people. Now, in the 1950s, because of mechanization and because of the growing and roaring economy, Americans didn't need to have their kids working in factories. American children didn't need to work. And this, of course, led them to have all sorts of free time, which leads, of course, to other problems, as you may be familiar with. Hopefully, you're not too familiar with those problems. And so the kids can now go to school. They can go clear through high school. In fact, our economy is so successful that people don't actually have to produce anything useful until they're in their 20s. In fact, many people in our society today, because our culture and our technology is so well advanced, they really don't have to do anything their entire lives. They can just basically live off the luxury of what technology and mechanization has brought to them. Yeah, and so, yeah, you're welcome, teenagers. You get to have a time where you don't have to do anything if you don't want. You don't have to produce anything if you don't want. And oftentimes in the 1950s, we'll see that these kids were spoiled. You have to remember that their parents bravely fought in World War II, and before that endured the Great Depression. And so they wanted their kids to have the best lives. And so oftentimes the children that were growing up in the 1950s, the baby boomers, when they were young, by the 1960s, they're becoming young adults. They were a bit spoiled at times. And they even made a movie about this called Rebel Without a Cause. James Dean, he's rebellious in the 1950s. Why is he rebellious? He doesn't even know. He literally has the best life of any generation that has ever existed on planet Earth, and yet they're still rebellious. And of course, the music is this way as well. You've got Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Frank Sinatra seems to mostly be popular with the elderly people, not with the young people. And then, of course, in the 1960s, you have the Beatles. Let's talk really quickly about Eisenhower's role domestically and his impact on the American economy. American technology, mechanization, and the railroads made it possible for goods to be moved from point A to point B throughout the United States in an incredibly complex distribution system. However, with railroads, the cost of moving an item was quite expensive because of the handling. It would have to be made at the factory, be loaded onto trucks, taken to the railroad yard where it would be loaded onto the trains. The trains would stop, it would be offloaded onto trucks and then taken to the stores where the product could be purchased from people. That's a lot of handling that goes, that is required. In the 1950s, Eisenhower passed what the Wall Street Journal will declare as the single most important factor for the economy in America in the latter half of that century. What is this? It's the building of the interstate system. See, Eisenhower had been to Germany and had seen how effective and functional Adolf Hitler's Autobahn was, and when he became president, thought it would be useful to put this in place here. And so what it's going to do for handling is eliminate the train, right? So you load stuff directly onto the truck, and then you drop it off at the store, or have it locally delivered, potentially even to a family. And so you are literally handling the product 1/2 the amount that you did before. And so this allows for things to cost less because of the handling. Eisenhower's rationale for this highway system and how he got it passed through Congress was to basically say, well, what would happen if the Russians landed on the West Coast? It would take a long time for the Russians to get all the way, or excuse me, take a long time for the Americans to get the military from the East Coast over here to defeat the Russians. By the time that happened, us Oregonians would probably already be speaking Russian. And so this is what helps convince Congress that this is worthwhile. And once again, the byproduct of this, after getting this thing built over the next 10, 15 years, was the improved and growing economy. There is a downside to this, however. You'll note that most interstate highways go right through the middle of large cities, oftentimes splitting the rich and the poor right in half, keeping the poor side even poorer. Just go through Salem. The east side is the side that you might get shot. Portland, the east side is the side that you might get shot. And in many cities in California, there is a side where you will get shot. So keep that in mind when you're driving down there. And so you could say that this is not an equitable thing, the interstate. But beyond that, it is very, very useful to the expanding American economy. Eisenhower's second term foreign policy. We Americans knew those Russians were up to no good, or at least that's what we believed, and on some level they really were up to no good. They were the first to send a satellite into space. Sputnik was sent into space, and Americans immediately responded with our own satellite called the Vanguard. Of course, as you can see from the video, that the Vanguard is not a particularly successful endeavor. And this led many Americans to wonder if Eisenhower was actually asleep at the wheel. What are the Russians doing that we're not doing? Clearly, they are being successful. And this led to a certain amount of hysteria. In fact, some Americans were even building nuclear bomb shelters in their backyard. Many Americans felt that the Russians, because of things like Sputnik, were clearly more technologically advanced than we were. But was this true? Did the Russians have missile superiority? Well, there was a missile gap, it's true, but it was in our favor. A 5-to-1 missile superiority in our favor. And Eisenhower knew it, but couldn't tell anyone. How did he know this? How did he know that we had a 5-to-1 missile superiority? Well, he decided, his source was the U-2 spy planes that, of course, had been taking images of what the Soviets had. We saw what they had, we knew what we had, and these spy planes were highly secretive. And so he did not reveal his source. I guess he had to let the Americans panic. And of course, this was to his own detriment. People actually accused him, criticized him of being, once again, asleep at the wheel. He's an old man, doesn't know what's going on. Clearly, Eisenhower's too old to be president. Eisenhower highly prized his reputation and would have liked to preserve his reputation during this time, but I think he deserves high praise for keeping this secret. After all, there'd be others who wouldn't do such a thing. And so once again, his policy is to put the nation's security before his own. This is an image of Eisenhower and Khrushchev together. Did they have friendly relations in the 1950s? Well, the answer is no. See, Eisenhower has a goal. He wants to put in place a nuclear arms test ban treaty. This, of course, would keep both of these two great nations from expending lots of money, developing new technology, nuclear technology. Additionally, frankly, the United States had, they were ahead of the Russians, and so it would make sense for us to put this test ban in place. This failed. Was Khrushchev to blame? Yes, he was. Everyone blames Khrushchev. Russian historians, American historians, even American-hating American historians would blame Khrushchev. One final note about Eisenhower's foreign policy. In his second term, Nikita Khrushchev insisted that the United States remove itself from Berlin. You remember at the end of World War II, Berlin was divided into spheres of influence, with the Soviets not cooperating with the Americans, the British, and the French. Khrushchev set a date where the United States was to be required to leave Berlin. And what did Eisenhower do here? Of course, a weaker president might have made some sort of a fuss about this, but Eisenhower simply ignored the order, and Americans stayed. And of course, Khrushchev couldn't really do anything, which once again shows the importance of and strength of Eisenhower's presidency. He doesn't back down. He acted like there was no deadline. Go Eisenhower. In summary, Eisenhower was a great American hero. Perhaps he was the last great president in our history. I have no doubt that he was the last great president of the 20th century. He recognized the proper threat of the Soviets and responded appropriately. He had the right response to both the political left and the political right by embracing the middle way. Throughout Eisenhower's administration, there was reasonable budgets, reasonable defense spending. Throughout the 1950s, with a slight hiccup in 53 or 54, we had, for the most part, a growing economy. The Interstate Highway Bill remains one of the most important domestic legacies of Eisenhower's presidency, and it really has helped to shape and grow our economy. If there's one critique of Eisenhower, I think it would be that he was socially hands-off for the most part. Racism was still a tremendous problem in the 1950s. Jim Crow was still basically in place. Eisenhower's administration didn't do much to push equality forward. And finally, maybe most importantly, Eisenhower was a Republican. He is the first Republican that we had as president after Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was put in place. Many Democrats feared that with the Republican presidency, the New Deal would be destroyed, would be dismantled. But Eisenhower did not do that. In fact, the New Deal stayed, and I think that finally here we can see the New Deal in its fullness. And so let me go back and address the New Deal and the 3 R's. It's true the New Deal did provide a great deal of relief for the Americans in the 1930s. The New Deal did help the economy to some extent, but full recovery was not made during the Depression. But was there reform? Was there a lasting reform which allowed for the stability of the United States economy for the most part, where the federal government would have access to all sorts of tools to address any potential economic downturn? And of course, we're seeing this even right now in the coronavirus epidemic, how the full weight of the federal government is getting behind a stimulus package. The New Deal is not destroyed, the reforms stay. And frankly, I think that we can appreciate Eisenhower for being not too unlike George Washington, for letting his own reputation be tarnished for the sake of our country, for keeping peace and prosperity at home, even though he was recognized primarily as a great military leader. And that's all I have for you on Eisenhower. We'll see you on the other side.